100 has to be equal to 9p, or in other words, equilibrium product price, P star is equal to 100. Now we're not quite done here. We've got to make sure that we've got to figure out the equilibrium quantity too. So we can take this price, P star, and plug it into the demand curve. So when the price is 100, what's the quantity demanded going to be? 500, right? And then if you want to make sure, if you want to check whether or not you've done your math right, you can also verify that at this price, the quantity supplied is equal to 500. So again, if we plug 100 into the supply, the equation for the supply curve, 4 times 100 is 400, plus 100 is 500. Okay, and those things should be equal because that's exactly what this whole exercise was about. It was about finding the price that was going to equate the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So all we've done here is we've just mathematically done what we did on the previous page. Okay, so that's how you find the equilibrium price when you're given an equilibrium quantity, when you're given equations for the supply curve and the demand curve, as opposed to just a picture of the supply curve and demand curve. Okay, so questions about that? Okay, so here's the part where I skip over 4 pages of notes. And we'll come back to that. The notes are still important, but we're going to come back. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about how we predict changes in the equilibrium price and quantity. And what happens when, for example, supply or demand increase or decrease. So the first thing I want to talk about is an example of an increase in supply. So let me just start off with a market that's in equilibrium. And here's our initial equilibrium price and our initial equilibrium quantity. So let's put some structure on this. What should this be a market for? Somebody give me a market. Shoes? Shoes, sure. Okay, let's suppose this is the market for shoes. So now I want you to tell me a factor, or tell me, raise your hand if you want to tell me something that might increase the supply of shoes. In other words, something that's going to shift this supply curve. So what's something that might increase the supply of shoes? Yeah.
Increasing the technology used to produce shoes, so manufacturing process.
Right, so let's suppose that you're going from a situation where someone is like hand sewing shoes to the introduction of some sort of shoe sewing machine. Okay. So it's a new kind of production technology. So we might have some sort of technological innovation. It's funny, we're talking about shoes. One of the most random things I've done in my life was to tour a shoe factory in Zimbabwe. It's true, I have done that. I know a little bit, actually, a bizarrely strange amount about technology shoe production. In any case, what's going to happen here? Okay, so what's an increase in supply going to look like? It means that at every price, the quantity supplied is going to be higher. So this supply curve is going to shift to the right. So this is what an increase in supply will look like. Again, beware of the optical illusion that it looks like supply is decreasing because it looks like the second supply curve is lower than the top supply curve. Okay, remember we talked about this? There's this strange optical illusion with the supply curve. Just go back to the definition. An increase in supply means that at every price, the quantity supplied is higher. Okay, so if you think about it from that perspective, this does indeed look like an increase in supply. What's going to happen? Well, we can easily see where the new equilibrium price is going to be. It's going to be at the price that's going to equate the quantity demanded with the new supply curve. So the new equilibrium price is going to be P star sub 1. And the new equilibrium quantity is going to be Q star sub 1. So typically, we think that when supply increases, market price should fall, and equilibrium quantity should increase. So if there's a technological innovation in terms of shoe production, we would expect shoes to become cheaper, and we would expect more shoes to be bought and sold in the market. Now just a couple technical points while we're looking at this. This increase in the supply of shoes also leads to an increase in the quantity of shoes demanded. So the price of shoes started off at P star naught, and it the quantity demanded sort of increased along the demand curve. Okay, so remember, demand did not change. Demand did not change. The demand curve is fixed, but the quantity demanded increased. Okay, because the price of shoes fell, so the quantity of shoes demanded increased. So so now you're hopefully starting to see why it's important to make this distinction between quantity demanded and demand and quantity supplied and supply. Things get a little bit muddy if you don't keep those distinctions clear. Okay, so an increase in supply is going to lead to this increase in the quantity demanded. It's also going to lead to a decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. Questions about this? Yeah.
What if I guess that demand has always been there, it's just the supplier didn't supply it at that, or didn't supply it at that cost. So like if you look at the supply curve, yeah, and then you moved it, but the original one, that demand was always there at that price, no?
That's right. So demand, there was no change in sort of consumers' willingness to pay for shoes. Their demand for shoes, the relationship between the price of shoes and the quantity of shoes demanded didn't change. Nothing was going on for consumers. That was fixed. Okay. But the increase in the supply of shoes drove the price of shoes down, and that's going to lead to consumers to want to have more shoes. Okay, so it's going to increase the quantity of shoes demanded. And if in case you're wondering, what's the process here? And I'll write this in green because you don't have to write this down. But notice that if the equilibrium price had stayed at P star sub naught and the supply curve had moved out, we would have had excess supply in this market. We would have had a surplus of shoes in the market, and that would have led to a drop in the price of shoes. That's another way to see that this equilibrium price is going to be falling. If it hadn't fallen, we'd have a surplus of shoes, and that would lead to a decrease in price. So there's a blank slide here for you to try on your own. We won't do it now, but it's decreasing supply. Now let's go ahead and talk about an increase in demand and how that might affect the market. So these blank slides are really just meant for you to, as you're going through and studying for the midterm, there's some exercises for you to work on your own. I won't go through all of the cases in class because it can get a little bit tedious if we dwell too long on this. Okay, so I need another market.
Video games.
Video games, there we go. Okay, video games. How do you purchase video games these days?
Starting to do them online.
You go online, purchase them, you download them, and then
you can download them. Yeah.
I toured a shoe factory in Zimbabwe, but I know nothing about purchasing video games. Okay, so video games. What's something that might increase the demand for video games? A new release. I understand what you mean, that the new release of a video game. Do you mean a new release of an existing video game, or it's really a different? I don't want to use that example because it's really a different product. Okay, so let's just imagine that you've got video games, some demand for video games out there. Video games are all. Let's imagine they're all some sort of uniform product. We don't think about sort of changes in the quality of the product. What's something that might lead to an increase in demand?
Releasing a new system, and then people get that, and they
I'm going to rephrase what you said as a drop in the price. Are they called consoles? Is that what they're called? Market I know nothing about. Okay, so right, this is like an Xbox, right? If Xbox becomes cheaper, is that a concept? My kids are only 5 and 3. When they get older, I'm sure I'll know more than I ever wanted to know about video games. But right now, I'm totally ignorant. Okay, so a drop in the price of consoles. That's kind of like the introduction of a new console. Okay, it's sort of like saying, it's sort of like the introduction of a new console. Be a drop in the price. Think of it as the same thing. Okay, so drop in the price of consoles is going to make people want to buy more consoles. And because they're buying more consoles, there's going to be an increase in the demand for the video games. And so demand is going to shift up, shift out. So this is an increase in demand. So what is this going to do? Well, this is going to tend to drive up the equilibrium price. Because you can see now that the new price that's going to equate the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded is going to be higher. Or thinking about it another way, if the price of video games had remained constant, there would have been excess demand for video games, and that would have driven the price up. And we're going to have an increase in the equilibrium quantity. So it's kind of interesting, right? You think it's a really great thing when the price of video game consoles drops. In fact, it might make the video games that you're trying to purchase more expensive, but still more people are going to be buying them. Okay, so prices might go up, but more people are going to be buying them. So that's what would happen in a market like this. Again, notice that the increase in the price of these consoles had no effect on supply. The supply curve didn't move, but there was an increase in the quantity supply. So here we have an increase in the quantity supplied, even though supply did not change. So that's what happened. Higher equilibrium quantity, higher equilibrium price. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about this now. So, like computer games, it's a download-based system, so the supply, there's an infinite supply. How does that work?
That's a really good question. It's a very excellent question. So let's think about this. Let's draw that picture. Okay, so let's draw that picture. We're going to be talking about, we'll talk more about this in a few weeks, or maybe even Monday when we start thinking about elasticity. You guys don't know what that word means yet, but let's just do a quick example of this. I think what you're saying is that the supply curve for video games looks something like the following. Basically, the cost of producing another video game, right? The marginal is pretty. Not only is it pretty low, but it's not increasing very much as you produce more video games. So that's probably what it looks like. That's probably remember, what does the supply curve tell us? It tells us the amount, it tells us the reservation price of the marginal seller. In other words, that's the amount you have to pay a seller to get them to produce an additional unit. For video games, it's going to be low, and it's not going to be increasing very much as you produce more. That's my guess. And so that's what the supply curve might look like. We have a demand curve that looks like this. Now, let's suppose that the price, so we have an initial equilibrium price, initial equilibrium quantity. And now let's suppose that we're doing the same thing that we did before. Let's suppose that the demand for video games increases because the price of these consoles drops. find the new equilibrium price. And the new equilibrium quantity. So it is still the case that the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity increase. But price doesn't go up by very much. It doesn't go up by very much. And in this market, this probably makes a lot of sense. If the price of video game consoles drops, it's hard to imagine that the price of video games would skyrocket. It might go up a little bit. What you really see is a huge increase in demand. Okay? And so when you're making these predictions, I'm not going to ask you about these subtleties, but when you start thinking about these markets and thinking about predicting the changes in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, it's going to be important to sort of start thinking about really what does the supply curve look like for a particular industry. And I think for the video game industry, we can probably pretty sure the supply curve looks something like the following. That's my guess. Okay, did that answer your question?
I think so.
Yeah.
Should the supply curve be sloping like downward if, say, the initial price of producing video games is very large, that the price of downloads is basically non-existent, then every further copy you would sell would sort of decrease the total price?
So that's a really excellent question. That is a really interesting point. Typically, we think that supply curves are upward sloping for a couple of reasons. So you were talking about one particular company, and this is not the supply curve for a firm. This is an industry supply curve. So the best way to think about this is really just that as the price of video games increases, in this case, there are going to be more companies that are going to be willing to enter into the video game market. Okay? And that's what's going to lead to this upward sloping supply curve. Also, I mean, even for video games, at some point, and I think the cost of producing an initial video game is probably pretty close to zero. But it's hard to believe it's getting cheaper and cheaper to produce each additional unit. And it's maybe, but at some point, you know, you're going to have to build another factory, and you know, it's maybe not for video games. Yeah, but you know, how do you get a server that's big enough to handle your supply? I mean, there are things that are going to be hard. But really, what's happening, I think, in the video game market, this is going to be upward sloping because more and more countries are going to enter into the video game market. Okay, other questions? When we so here's how this class works. This is going back to your question. What we do is we talk about supply and demand in these very general terms. And then we're going to go back, and once we're done talking about elasticity, we're going to go back and really understand the behavioral model that underlies this demand curve and the behavioral model that underlies the supply curve. And then we're going to be talking a lot more about sort of cost of production and how that influences the supply curve, and you'll get a much better understanding of what lies behind this. Okay. Other questions? Okay, so when only one curve is shifting, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going to be happening to the quantity supply and the quantity demand. And so I did an increase in supply and an increase in demand. I left for you on your own to work through what would happen if you had a decrease in supply and a decrease in demand. So you can, those are the blank slides in your notes. You can feel free to work through those. And now I want to talk about what's going to happen if we have simultaneous shifts in supply and demand. What can we say about equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity when both supply and demand are moving around? So now I want to think about a situation in which supply and demand are moving in the same direction. And it turns out that in those cases, you can make definite predictions about equilibrium quantity, but not equilibrium price. Right, so what do I mean by this? So let's suppose that we have a situation where both supply and demand increase. And on the left, I'm going to draw a really big increase in demand and a really small increase in supply. Okay, so let's go ahead and plot first the initial equilibrium quantity. So before we had any of these shifts, the initial equilibrium price. So Q star naught and Q star naught. And similarly, I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the right. So going back to what's happening on the left here, demand is going to really, really increase by a lot. Supply increases by just a little bit. And we're going to see that we have an increase in equilibrium price and also an increase in equilibrium quantity. Now let's look at a similar situation on the right where both supply and demand increase, but this time let's suppose that it just so happens that the increase in demand is relatively small. And the increase in supply is really, really big. In this case, we can actually see that the equilibrium price has fallen, but we still get that the equilibrium quantity has increased. This is what I mean. So obviously when you're looking at these two pictures, one of the things that you see is that we've had an increase in supply and increase in demand in both. But in one case, equilibrium price went up, and in the other case, equilibrium price went down. So we were able to make definitive predictions about equilibrium quantity. We know that equilibrium quantity is going to go up no matter what, but what happens to equilibrium price is going to depend upon the magnitude of the shift in the supply curve and the demand curve. And this is important because let's suppose that all you know is that the supply of shoes, for example, has increased because of say, some technological innovation, and the demand for shoes has increased maybe because shoes are a normal good and consumers have gotten more income. If all you know is that supply has increased and the demand has increased, you really can't predict what's going to happen to equilibrium price unless you sort of know exactly what these supply curves look like. But if all you know is that consumer incomes have gone up and that there's a new shoe production technology has been introduced, you can't really predict what's going to happen to equilibrium price, but you can probably, you can be pretty sure that the number of shoes bought and sold in the market is going to increase. So here's a situation where you're sort of uncertain about what's going to be happening for one of these factors, but you know what's going to happen for the other. So this is a scenario where supply and demand moved in the same direction. Let's look at a different scenario where supply and demand are moving in the opposite direction. So let's go ahead and write down the initial equilibrium price and quantity. So let's suppose that in the first picture we have a really big shift out in demand. And a small shift back in supply. So supply decreases by a little bit, and demand increases by a lot. So again, we have this shift back in supply and this increase in demand. What's the new equilibrium price going to be? The new equilibrium price is going to be much higher. And we're also going to have an increase in the equilibrium quantity. Demand went out, supply shifted back, prices went up, quantity went up. Now let's think about sort of a similar situation on the right, but let's suppose that the shift in the demand curve is relatively small. We had a tiny shift out in demand, so demand increases, but it's a pretty small shift. And let's suppose that supply moves back by a lot. It's decrease in supply, it's increase in demand. Now we have that the equilibrium price has gone up relative to what it was before, but the equilibrium quantity has fallen. So now when supply and demand are moving in opposite directions, you can see that we get quantity increasing in one scenario and quantity decreasing in the other. In both cases, price went up, but we weren't able to you can't make definite predictions about what's going to be happening to equilibrium quantity unless you know something about the shift in the magnitude of the supply curve and demand curve. So for example, let's go back to thinking about the market for shoes. I was listening to the news the other day, and apparently there was a big snowstorm in the Midwest that wiped out a lot of the cattle in the Midwest. So I think some farmers lost maybe 50% of their cattle stocks. What are some of the things that are used? What are some of the things that you make from cattle? Well, they provide leather, and you use leather to make shoes. Okay? So you can imagine that the price of leather is going to increase. That's an input to shoes. That's going to lead to a decrease in the supply of shoes. Okay? If leather prices go up because of the snowstorm that killed many of the cattle that are in the Midwest, supply is going to drop. And if we think that consumer incomes are increasing, which right now they are not, because the government is shut down, but if we think that consumer incomes are increasing and that shoes are a normal good, we might expect the demand for shoes to increase. Okay, so if all you know is that the supply of shoes decreased and that the demand for shoes has increased, then you know that shoes are going to become more expensive, but you don't know whether or not more shoes are going to be bought and sold in the market. Okay, so again, if supply and demand move in opposite directions, then you can make definite predictions about price, but not equilibrium quantity. Okay, so questions about that? So you should, in your homework, have, and also in the discussion section questions, have lots and lots of examples of working through scenarios like this, where either the supply curve shifts, or the demand curve shifts, or both curves shift, and you have to make predictions about what's going to be happening to equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And in some cases, you're going to be able to say something definite about price, but not about quantity. In other cases, you're going to be able to say something definite about quantity, but not about price, depending on how those curves are shifting. Okay. Questions about this? All right, so now I'm back to, so I sort of showed you guys, we've worked through market equilibrium, okay? We have talked about supply, we've talked about demand, we've talked about market equilibrium, we've talked about what happens when supply moves and when demand moves, how we make predictions about changes in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So we've moved through a lot. And now I want to take you back to the questions that I motivated this entire chapter with. So I want you to go back, so sort of set supply and demand aside for just a minute or two. Go back to this sort of thought exercise that I put you through. I said, pretend you are a benevolent dictator, and you have been put in charge of the U.S. economy. And you have to decide what goods and services are going to get produced. So, how many pints of strawberry ice cream, how many pints of peanut butter cup chip ice cream, what kinds of shoes, what kinds of houses, what kinds of cars, everything. You're going to make all the decisions about what goods and services should get produced. You're going to have to make decisions about how you should produce them. Right? So what production technology should you use? Who are the people who are in your country who you should put in charge of making shoes? Who should be put in charge of making video games? How should people be allocated? And you also have to make some decisions about once these things are actually produced, who's going to get them? Okay, so it's a tremendous amount. You know, who's going to get the strawberry ice cream? Who's going to get the peanut butter ice cream? How many pints? Where are they going to live? All that kind of stuff. So, you know, all of these decisions. It's actually pretty overwhelming, right? When you think, I could be a benevolent dictator, it sounds pretty good, but then when you start thinking about having to answer all these questions, it quickly becomes really overwhelming. It turns out that the market delivers answers to all of these questions. So let me show you how that works. So what I want to show you is that the market equilibrium does in fact answer all of those questions. So here's the market equilibrium. Okay, does it answer the questions? I want you to set aside for a minute whether or not it does a good job answering the questions. We'll get to that in just a minute. What I want to just establish now is that it does answer those questions. So first of all, it's going to tell you what should get produced. The market is going to tell you what should get produced. It's going to tell you how much. The market is going to make a decision about how much of every product is going to get produced. In some cases, the equilibrium quantity might be 0. Okay, that could happen. Equilibrium quantity could be really, really large, but there's going to be an equilibrium quantity for every good out there in the market. The market is going to tell you how much of every single kind of good should be produced. So as the dictator, you're relieved because it's an overwhelming job that I've given you, and at least the market is helping you answer one of those questions. The second question that the market has to answer is, or that we want to answer, is who's going to produce it? Who is going to produce every single product? Well, we talked about this before. Who's going to produce it? Those are going to be all of the people whose sort of willingness to provide an additional unit of this good, whose cost of producing this good is less than the equilibrium price. The suppliers who have a low reservation price. The suppliers who are willing to produce another unit for a price that's less than the market price. Okay, so it's going to tell you who should be producing it. And again, this is really obvious. Like if the candy bar costs $1, who's going to produce it? Anyone who can produce it for less than $1. And then the last question was, so now you know how much is getting produced, you know who's going to produce it, you also have to figure out, well, who's going to get it. And again, in this case, it's going to be the consumers who value the good the most who are going to get the goods. Okay, so anyone who values this product at an amount greater than P star is going to buy it. So suddenly, the market has answered your questions. The market is now saying, this is how much is going to get produced. We know who's going to produce it, and we know who's going to get it. The people who value it the most are going to get it. The people who can produce it the most cheaply are going to produce it, and boom, this is how much they're going to buy and sell it to one another. So the market answers this really complex set of questions. Okay? The next thing we have to sort of worry about is, or actually, let me just sort of before I go there any further. Let me just sort of say that one of the amazing things about the market equilibrium is that we say that it leaves no unexploited opportunities for individuals. So what do we mean by this? So I want to talk more about sort of what an equilibrium actually means. We know that it answers these 3 questions. I want to talk a little bit more about what it means. So what is buyer's surplus? Again, that's the difference between the buyer's reservation price and the price he or she actually pays. And then we have the seller's surplus, which is the difference between the price received by the seller and his or her reservation price. Total surplus is going to be the difference between a buyer's reservation price and a seller's reservation price. So for example, what do we mean when we say the market leaves no unexploited opportunities for individuals? What I mean by this is that, let's suppose that equilibrium quantity, or let's suppose that the quantity being produced is down here. let's suppose some amount less than the equilibrium quantity. What I want, and let me go back to the previous slide just a minute, so I'm going to make sure I emphasize what total surplus is. So buyer surplus, to be really clear, let me make sure I write down all the pieces here. So buyer surplus is the difference between the buyer's reservation price and the market price. That's what buyer surplus is. So for example, if you value a cup of coffee at $3 and you pay $2 for it, the surplus that you get is $1. Okay, buyer's surplus is just the difference between the amount that a buyer's reservation price is, of what they value that product for, and what they actually pay, the market price. What is the seller's surplus? That's just the difference between the price the seller actually receives, which is the market price, it's the amount they receive for their products, minus the seller's reservation price. And so if you're a seller and it costs you $1 to produce an additional candy bar or additional cup of coffee, and you got $2 for that cup of coffee, so it cost you $1 to produce it, you got $2 for it, then that seller is going to get $1 worth of surplus, which is the price that they received minus the reservation price. So what's total surplus? Total surplus is just the sum of buyer's surplus and seller's surplus. And if you look at these two equations that I wrote down for buyer's surplus and seller's surplus, and you know that the market price is going to be the same for buyers and sellers, then total surplus is just equal to buyer's reservation price minus the seller's reservation price. That's what total surplus is equal to. The idea here is that when we say that a market equilibrium leaves no unexploited opportunities for individuals, we're going to borrow upon this concept of total surplus. So let's go back to this example here. Let's suppose that this is the amount that's being produced in this market. Notice that there was surplus on the last unit. When you're thinking about, should I produce this, should this very last unit be produced? Notice that there's surplus on that unit. Total surplus is positive. In other words, if we think that the demand curve measures the buyer's reservation price, and we think that the supply curve measures the seller's reservation price, then the distance that I'm about to indicate here is going to be the total surplus from that transaction. So that distance there, if this is the amount that's being produced in the market, this distance here tells you the surplus that you're getting on that last unit that's sold. Should this unit be produced? Yes, because there was surplus, economic surplus was generated from the sale of this last unit. Because the amount that the buyers valued it, their reservation price was greater than the seller's reservation price. Should the unit after that be produced? Yes, there's surplus on it, it should be produced. The unit after that? Yes, there's surplus. We should keep going. All of these little units, as we increase output, there's a positive surplus associated with the production of all of these units, all the way until we get here. And then after that, there's no more surplus. We've taken advantage of all the surplus that there is. In fact, if we go any further, our surplus is going to start to be negative. Because the difference between the buyer's reservation price and the seller's reservation price is going to be negative. So this is the sense in which the equilibrium leaves no unexploited opportunities. We're out of time. Come ask me after class. We'll talk more about this on Friday.